Welcome back to Velshi Ruhle. New questions about the business and personal relationships of registered sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, who was charged last month with sex trafficking of minors. Epstein has pleaded not guilty, and according to his filing made this morning, his attorney says they will appeal to the judge's decision to deny him bail. In a close look at Epstein's circle, New York Magazine examines the, quote, cesspool of elites, many of them in New York, who allowed Jeffrey Epstein to flourish with impunity, including former President Bill Clinton and ousted CBS anchor Charlie Rose. Joining me now, deputy editor of New York Magazine, David Wallace-Wells. David, help this. I must read this. Very top of the article, this quote. It's stunning to me. For decades, important, influential, serious people attended Epstein's dinner parties, rode his private jet, and furthered the fiction that he was some kind of genius hedge fund billionaire. There is a long list of elites, some of the most powerful people in New York. Why is it, how is it that this guy was able to get so many of them in his web?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, and I don't actually feel like we know the answer yet. I think that the story is still very much behind closed doors. We don't yet totally understand how Epstein made his money. He's said to be a hedge fund manager, but we only know that he ever had one client who dropped him 15 years ago. Nobody on Wall Street has any memory of having any dealings with him at all. There's some thought that he may have been setting up tax shelters for some of these billionaires. Some thought that he may have been trafficking in Saudi money because he has relationships in Saudi Arabia. There's even some implication, kind of unfounded, that he may have some intelligence relationship either with Israel or with the U.S. I think we really don't yet know the nature of a lot of these relationships, but it's clear that he had in his network not just most of the most powerful people in New York, many of the most powerful people in the world. Ehud Barak was one of his, was close to him, Prince Andrew from the UK. Now, the nature of these relationships is similarly unclear. He seemed to have a social relationship with many of these people, almost all of whom are men. Some of them were at parties where some kind of unseemly things were happening, but it's not clear which of them were involved, to what degree, who may be implicated beyond just having a friendship relationship with him. For me, the question is, how did so many people, especially after he pled guilty to soliciting prostitution in 2008, how did so many of these people continue to associate with him in the years since? He's been really involved with Harvard, funding a lot of their scientific research. He's been a major fixture in the New York social world since. Peggy Siegel has been throwing parties for him.
And what has been the argument from these people, right? If I'm the founder of Apollo and I have access to the most sophisticated tax preparers on the planet, what is the rationale being given by some of these luminaries as to why exactly Jeffrey Epstein was in their life? Often, when it's a genius investor, they could point to it. They could say, John Paulson is the godfather of the subprime trade. He made me all of this money. What has the explanation been from these people? Mostly
they've pled ignorance, and they actually don't have financial relationships that we know of to him. As I said, there's only one person we ever know ever had his money managed by Jeffrey Epstein. That's Les Wexner, who is the founder of Victoria's Secret, among other things, and who was Epstein's kind of patron. In fact, he gave Epstein the home that Epstein lived in until he was just arrested, which is the biggest house in all of New York City.
Has Les Wexner given any rationale behind why would he give him a home that's now valued at
$77 million.
$77 million.
No, it's a quite murky story. He made a statement to his employees last week, just that I cut off my relationship with him after the crimes came out in 2008. But he gave no full accounting of why they had a relationship in the first place or what the nature of that relationship was. So I think it's all still very, very unclear, and it's quite possible that as this criminal proceeding goes forward, we learn a lot more. I think it's especially notable that the charges were brought by the Public Corruption Unit of the Southern District of New York, which suggests that at the very least some public figures are going to be involved in the scandal. They may even in some ways be a target of the investigation, although we haven't yet found that out. I want to share a couple of names that are noteworthy and newsworthy, but we haven't heard in a while, and people might not realize their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. It's about Epstein's relationship with Charlie Rose, saying Epstein had recommendations for whom Rose ought to hire as his next assistant. And here's what you write. Written call logs from 2005 and 6 show Epstein and his own assistant calling dozens of times, making plans for lunch and tea in Manhattan or to try to meet up in Paris. Epstein also called with a total of 5 women's names and phone numbers. One woman was described as the world's most perfect assistant.
She used to work for Harvey Weinstein. He's lucky if he can get her. Another entry reads, Jeffrey Epstein wants to talk to you before you call these two girls. What does it mean that Jeffrey Epstein found girls and then recommended them for jobs for people like Charlie Rose and former President Bill Clinton?
Well, I think I want to be careful in not going too far in suggesting the relationship these men had and how they manipulated and took advantage of some of these women. But I think it's certainly very telling that there seemed to have been a quite close network of predatory men, powerful predatory men in the New York elite social world who were in some sense coordinating their actions with one another. Whether or not Jeffrey Epstein was making an earnest, totally above board recommendation for an assistant or something a little more scandalous, we don't yet know. But the fact that there was this shared association and they were trading information about these young women is itself quite sickening.
Near perfect assistant. She worked for Harvey Weinstein. I wanted to share, we did reach out to Charlie Rose's team for a statement. We have not heard back yet, but President Bill Clinton's press secretary did give us a statement, and I want to share it. President Clinton knows nothing about the terrible crimes Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to in Florida some years ago, or those with which he has been recently charged in New York. He has not spoken to Epstein in well over a decade and has never been to Little St. James Island, Epstein's ranch in New Mexico, or his residence in Florida. David, thank you so much. Guess what? You have a lot more reporting to do.
Tell me about it.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.